Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to do a bit of an in-depth discussion, or I guess just share my thoughts on one of my more recent reads in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. I have many thoughts on this book, having just finished it over this past weekend. Featured heavily in my latest reading vlog. If you haven't checked that out, be sure to do so. I thought it was pretty fun. But yeah, just wanted to sort of sit down, share my thoughts. I finished this book a couple days ago, and I've sort of just been racking my brain about what I really think about it. And yeah, let's get underway. Have some notes here on the side, maybe a brief spoiler warning. But ultimately this book is not about the events that occur within the plot. In my opinion, it's sort of about the introspection that the main character goes through. But yeah, let's get into it. So what is this book? It is a semi-autobiographical account on the life of James Joyce. But it is told through the eyes of our main character here named Stephen Dedalus. It's told through multiple phases of his life, from early childhood to young boyhood, early teenage years into his late teenage years. You can sort of think of it as different, chunks of life all throughout this book. It deals with many themes, and I think it's important to understand the climate, or I guess just the society that James Joyce and Stephen Dedalus grew up in at this time in the early 20th century Ireland. It's good to know some of the political going-ons. It's still under rule by Great Britain. They're looking to become an independent nation. A couple of parties are running. Just for that reason. In particular, Parnell, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is backed by the majority of Irish Catholics at this time, which is important to note because James Joyce and Stephen Dedalus were Catholic, and I think their family both supported him at the time. Other than that, like I said, it deals with a whole lot of things, but it is important to know the just very brief Irish history. I had no idea going into it. I'm saying this sort of after the fact, after I read the book and looked up some things to make a bit more sense. Having known things ahead of time, I think it would have made it a bit easier. I can link some resources down below, some of the things I read that I think may have helped just my wholly understanding this book. But I digress. This book deals with a whole lot of different themes. It deals with themes of religion, themes of sort of one's true calling and what someone was set on this earth to do. It deals with relationships, friendships, art, as it states in the title, A Portrait of the Artist. That's just sort of to name a few of them. It deals with family, grief, sexuality in a sense, and coming of age in that way. So yeah, it really has some, if you're in it for one or interested in any of those things, you can definitely get some nugget of value out of it. Now, this wasn't my first Joyce book I have read. I know he's sort of notoriously difficult and maybe even just confusing for confusing's sake. I read Dubliners by him at the start of the year, and I thought it was fabulous. There were a couple of stories I didn't really care for, but all in all, I thought it was a pretty interesting read, short story collection. That being said, I had a similar but not equal experience with this book. It's taken me 3 times to try and read this book now over the course of, I want to say 8 months or so. Taken me 3 times to read just because, and I say this sort of, I guess, with a grain of salt. The beginning of this book, I think, is the most confusing, convoluted, but also the best part of the book. I just really couldn't get past the first 60 pages or so on 2 different accounts, but now having read it 3 times, that ended up being my favorite part. I think it is really the antithesis of the coming of age story. I kept telling myself as I was reading this a quote I remembered from a different booktuber, Benjamin McAvoy. He reads a bunch of sort of classics, notoriously difficult classics. He's an English literature major and was helping people make sense in the world of classics. Something he says that I remind myself when I read challenging books is that confusion is the prelude to understanding. And so I repeated that to myself multiple times a page as I was getting through this book. Did it always work? No, I'm still pretty confused, but some things made more sense, obviously, and I was able to seek some enjoyment from this book. Like I said, it's the antithesis of a coming of age story. We're able to see how his mind and inner thoughts are sort of shaped by his experiences. And I say this, it's sort of unlike anything I've ever read. Obviously, it's a James Joyce book, so that alone should mark it as something unlike anything I've ever read. But just the introspection that Stephen Dedalus goes through, is it even believable for a 13 or 14-year-old or even a 9 or 8-year-old to think some of the things he's thinking? In my opinion, hell no. I think he's wise. We'll say he's wise beyond his years, but it didn't make it any less interesting. It did make it, I mean, it's fiction. It's elements of it are believable, elements of it are not believable, but in my opinion, some of the epiphanies that young Stephen was having at the ripe age of 11 were not things that were wholly on my radar as an 11-year-old. Obviously, this is just an opinion speaking from my experience and trying to rationalize with what Stephen was doing. But yeah, still interesting to read. You are definitely just seeing the world through his eyes as he's growing up. There are other books that come to mind, in my opinion, that I've read that do a better sort of storytelling job at the coming of age story. Namely, and written during a similar time frame as well, namely A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith and then The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I think both of those books just do a better job at being a story, but I know that wasn't the point really of this book, so I find it hard to compare them, but I figured I would just throw that out there. Written a little bit later, maybe in the mid 20th century as opposed to this, which was 1916, I believe, the others in the 1940s, so not really a fair comparison, but wanted to throw that out there as other books I have read that I maybe enjoyed a bit more that dealt with similar topics. But all in all, definitely an interesting read. It's written in a very stream of consciousness manner, has very good moments to it, has some very poor moments to it as well. Like I mentioned, the first portion of the book was both the worst and the best part for me. On my third reread, I ended up liking the beginning portion a whole lot more, maybe because I just understood what was happening and had some context going into it. I think the way that it is written, like basically through the eyes of a very young boy up until he's about 12, going away to boarding school, experiencing just making new friends in this religious boarding school and the things that he sees. I think the way that his mind processes these things and compartmentalizes them and the way he speaks to himself was, like I said, interesting, if at all not fully believable, but it definitely was an interesting way to see a book fold out through the eyes of such a young person. Another portion that comes to mind is when Stephen's a bit older. This, I guess, is a minor plot spoiler, but not really. Like I said, the book isn't about the plot per se, but he's a bit older. He goes on this retreat with his boarding school, and there's a vast, lengthy sermon given on hell, and it's very descriptive. It's about 20 pages or so in length, just this priest giving this sermon on hell. I thought that was one of the better written portions, mainly if it was maybe a more understandable portion of the book. That's why I gravitated to it as being one of the better parts. But with that being said, you can definitely see a distinct turning point you see Stephen before this sermon and then Stephen after this sermon, and it's basically a completely different character, the way he lives his life before versus after, and the way it changes his decisions and the things that he does, and ultimately what his, I guess, the big decision is at the end of the book. I won't spoil that because that's sort of the whole point of the book. But yeah, just speaking of like being the point of the book, I know when it comes to James Joyce, seemingly things are confusing for confusion's sake. Like I said, that quote I reminded myself of, confusion is a prelude to understanding. I think with that being said, and sort of in my experience reading it, trying to read it 3 times, not getting it, reading it for the 3rd time, and then enjoying that first bit that I had reread previously twice over being my favorite part. I think that just goes to show that maybe this book constitutes multiple readings over one's reading life, if you at all are interested in that sort of a thing. With this book taking place over multiple phases or seasons of life, I think it definitely has something for everyone to draw from it, and maybe even for some people to draw multiple things from it during multiple readings, as it does sort of navigate different topics at different stages of life. So we'll see. Will I ever reread this book? Having said that, maybe not. I read this in, I guess, sort of as a introduction, not an introduction, but I guess just to familiarize myself more with Joyce and his work before I read Ulysses. If I'm not mistaken, Stephen Dedalus is actually a character in Ulysses, so I think this book about Stephen will help me understand that portion of Ulysses a bit better. And yeah, I can definitely, maybe see myself rereading this in my older years. Definitely not anytime soon. I give this book 3 stars, maybe bump it down to like 2.5 stars. Like I said, there were some parts that were great. There were some parts that were like horrendous, but most of it was just sort of confusing. And yeah, I think that's that. Let me know down below if you have read this book or anything like it. It is truly like nothing I've ever read before, for better or for worse. I guess that's up for you to decide. Give it a read and let me know what you think. Appreciate you watching up until this point, this 13-minute ramble about some of the books I've read. I've done this a couple of times now, I think with Moby Dick, A Clockwork Orange, and there's probably another one in there. But yeah, just sort of like sharing my thoughts here. Let me know what you thought of it down below. Consider subscribing if you're new here. Give it a like if you liked it and all those YouTube things. I appreciate you watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for hanging out, guys.